Show now with Sarah Dunant.
Good evening. Later tonight we'll be profiling the Romanian-born violinist. His death last November led to widespread criticism of the media for not investigating his activities while he was still alive. The truth was, though, that there was no shortage of journalists investigating Maxwell. The problem was how far he let them get. Because over the years, Maxwell, with the help of an army of lawyers, had perfected a method of gagging potential critics by his blanket use of the libel laws. In effect, he used the law to censor the media. Francis Wheen, who himself tangled with Robert Maxwell over a Late Show item shown 2 years ago, explains, with the help of lawyers and journalists, just how Maxwell did it and what it felt like to be on the receiving end of one of those writs.
Robert Maxwell was a man of voracious appetite, but he didn't have much of an appetite for the Late Show. He was especially annoyed by a programme in 1990 where I drew attention to his connections with East European dictators, like Erich Honecker.
I complained to Michael Checkland, the Director General, and he fairly says, "I'm sorry you were distressed by Francis Wheen's item on the Late Show on the 17th of January. I don't believe the item went beyond proper bounds, but I've passed your letter to Michael Jackson, the program editor. He'll be writing to you shortly to explore the possibility of inviting you to appear on the program to answer this piece."
Maxwell saw himself as a great communicator. His business empire included newspapers, magazines, publishing houses and television companies. So, of course, he was a champion of journalistic freedom.
We are the fourth estate. The press cannot be gagged or muzzled.
It was very hard to reconcile his role as the publisher of national newspapers, to whom intrusion is a daily part of life, and his own role as a champion of the right to information, with the headlong charge he would take into litigation the moment somebody said something or wrote something, somebody went on television and criticized him, he would immediately say, "See what a writ will do."
Now, in theory, there's no such thing in English law as a gagging writ. But in practice, Robert Maxwell bombarded the press with so many libel writs that some editors just raised the white flag.
He used libel writs to gag people. I mean, the point of the writ was not that he really minded what had been said about him, it seemed to me, so much as that he wanted to stake off a whole area of his activity which you would be prevented from writing about for months or years to come. And that seemed to me to be very dangerous.
We will sue you, and we will do whatever it takes to protect our rights.
Maxwell's purpose was to make it impossible for any editor of a newspaper or television program or book to consider writing about him critically without considering the enormous cost, both financially and in time, that would entail, because Maxwell would condemn them and come down with them with the force of a bulldozer.
When Maxwell stood for Parliament in 1959, he served a libel writ on his Tory opponent on polling day. It's impossible to say precisely how many writs he issued in his life, but it certainly ran into hundreds. What effect did all this ceaseless litigation have on the people on the receiving end?
Well, the truth is, whenever anybody came forward with an idea to write a story about Robert Maxwell, my heart sank. And it sank because I knew the repercussions. There was going to be a writ. And if there's a writ, there is trouble. And so one thinks to oneself, do I need this? I've got all sorts of other problems. Do I need this particular problem? Do I need Robert Maxwell on my neck again?
When you get your first writ delivered to your home by a seedy bailiff on a dirty cold night, and you suddenly think, my God, here am I, the home is up for grabs, everything could go.
I think, if you look at the relatively small number of programmes about Maxwell over the years, you must draw the conclusion that many people thought about doing programmes about him and eventually decided not to because of the the risk of litigation and of potentially of very big damages, and also just the sheer pain and hard work that would go into the inevitable struggle about the programme. But in the case of Panorama, the idea only came up once and we decided to do it.
We completely changed our methods of working. I was continually changing our computer codes on all our files. We locked everything obsessively. I never used my own home telephone for business calls. I never used the telephone on my desk. I always used neighbouring ones. That was just trying to cover our tracks. And by and large, I think it must have worked, whether or not he was watching us, because he simply didn't know what was in the programme, and we caught him napping.
As Panorama's experience last year showed, his methods hadn't changed much since his first big run-in with investigative journalism. This was back in the 60s, when he discovered that the Sunday Times Insight team were on his tail.
He reacted volcanically. The first I was aware of was that he wrote letters to the publisher, Lord Thompson, to the editor-in-chief, Dennis Hamilton, and to Harry Evans, who was the editor. These letters were, I think it's fair to say, hysterical. They made all kinds of wild accusations against me, of whom he knew nothing. And the suggestion was that we were described as the poison weed scribes. And for some reason we were conducting a vendetta against Maxwell, which we had no reason to do.
The thing about British libel law is that defendants are presumed guilty until they can prove otherwise, so the odds were always stacked in Maxwell's favour.
If we made a statement about him, or indeed any other person who we thought had done something which people ought to know about, then the burden of proof was on us to take the time, to spend the money, to pay for the lawyers, to prove things. Now, sometimes it's quite hard to prove every last corner, and we could be sued and therefore discredited if we got anything wrong. We just said, see you in court. And of course we knew all along there was not the faintest chance of him coming to court, because we, as I said, we had everything absolutely lined up, and we could prove the truth of everything we said. So he wasn't going to do that. So in the end, as we expected, he backed off.
Although the Sunday Times managed to fend him off, it was such an expensive and exhausting victory that few other journalists felt like following the example. But one newspaper that did give the old rhinoceros a prod from time to time was The Independent. Last year it revealed that Peter Walker had had second thoughts about going to work for Maxwell.
Maxwell's reaction was very, very aggressive indeed. He immediately brought out a statement saying Peter Walker had actually declined the chairmanship, but with totally other reasons than the reasons that we had obtained and which were actually the case. He then sued us, as we expected. That was no surprise. But the next problem was he injuncted us. This was incredibly onerous. It was not only onerous because the injunction was there, but because of the way Robert Maxwell operated it. Because once the injunction was there, I started researching a story about his private finances. And I received a letter from his solicitors saying that in researching that story, I was actually spreading sedition and repeating the libel, and I was actually breaching the terms of the injunction.
The full might of the law came crashing down on anyone who stood in Robert Maxwell's way. Even some lawyers who make their living out of libel suits began to fear that he was overdoing it.
Maxwell had certainly issued a great many more writs than anyone else, and he, I think, has accentuated what really is wrong with the libel laws, because here we have seen the truth being clearly suppressed. In other cases, we've perhaps disapproved of the fact that wealthy businessmen can use their power and money, but they are, after all, protecting a reputation to which they are clearly entitled. In Maxwell's case, he wasn't entitled to this reputation, and he used the law of libel to pull the wool over people's eyes.
Libel exists in order to protect people of good name, good reputation, from having that reputation damaged by the publication of lies about them. Maxwell, like anybody else, was concerned about his reputation and took steps, like many other libel litigants, to protect it. I don't think it's possible to abuse libel laws. The laws are enforced by the courts, and whatever one thinks about them, in themselves, they can only be used, not abused.
The consequence of getting a writ is that newspaper immediately plunge into really quite enormous expenses. The thing doesn't get to court, and people say, but it never got to court. But it's just the basis of having to defend a writ before you get to court. Knowing perfectly well that Maxwell may very well have walked away sort of 2 years into the action. But by that time, you're into £20,000–30,000 worth of legal costs. So there's a considerable advantage in not writing those stories.
But one or two reporters still thought the story deserved to be told. 4 years ago, Tom Bower chanced his arm by writing a critical biography. In the early 70s, Bower had made a BBC documentary about Maxwell, who was then in disgrace after being judged unfit to run a public company by the Department of Trade and Industry. The film presented him as a tycoon in the tradition of Citizen Kane.
Many times in our island history have men from distant lands come to settle here and ended by making their mark on our society. But few immigrant stories have been more remarkable than that of Ian Robert Maxwell, patriot, politician, and tycoon extraordinary.
Citizen Maxwell hated it. "15 years later, Maxwell made desperate efforts to stop anyone reading Tom Bower's book. The man who'd won a military cross for courage in the Second World War now seemed to be terrified of a single unarmed author.
Maxwell was determined that the Sunday Times shouldn't serialise my book, because that would give the book an endorsement, it would give it authority, it would give it enormous widespread coverage. So he repeatedly rang up Rupert Murdoch, insisting that the book was libelous, although he hadn't even read it, let alone seen the cover. And after a time, Murdoch became weary of the calls and passed it on to Andrew Neil, the editor. Neil, to his credit, just stuck his heels in and said, "Look, I've bought it. I'm not going to be bullied."
Maxwell even issued a writ against his former secretary, Anne Robertson, accusing her and Bower of breach of confidence. This was after Bower had taken her out to lunch while researching his book.
Now, when we left the restaurant, her handbag was open. She's an old lady. I said to her, "Look, your handbag's open, you must be careful." So she gave me some papers to hold while she closed her bag and went on her way. Months later, when the documents came through on discovery of the basis of Maxwell's writ against me for breach of confidence, it was clear that the handing over of secret documents was the evidence which he said proved that there was a breach of confidence. So in other words, he'd had a detective watching us at this lunch.
While he was busy monitoring Tom Bower's lunches, maybe he should have kept a closer eye on one of his own executives, Peter Thompson, who, having left Maxwell's employ, co-wrote an alternative unauthorised biography. This book annoyed him even more than Bower's.
The book came out in February, and Maxwell was on his boat, the Lady Jelaine, in the Caribbean, and it came as something of a surprise to his people in London. It suddenly arrived. They heard the book was out in the shops, and half a dozen copies were quickly dispatched to the office, to Mirror Group newspapers, and it was faxed page by page to Robert Maxwell on his yacht. It took them most of the night to do it, and of course he was getting increasingly annoyed as he was reading each page as it came off the fax.
As soon as they felt the full wrath of Robert Maxwell, the publishers retreated. They promised to withdraw the book and remove all the so-called libels. The two authors didn't have much choice but to go along with this deal.
The writs were coming in at the rate of 3 or 4 a day. In the end, there was a total of 30 writs, and a judge had to set a deadline for the number of writs to come in. I spoke to Tony Delano, and he said, if we don't sign, the book is probably dead. This way we get a paperback out. So I agreed to the out-of-court settlement. He didn't like anything about the KGB. He didn't like any suggestion that he was a dishonest businessman. He didn't like any suggestion that he was deceitful. He felt that this would damage himself and his companies. And we amended the text, and in fact we were able to include and update certain things because we were having a go at a new version of the book.
The new version was published. Maxwell still wasn't happy.
The publishers rang me and said, "You won't believe this, but he's issued another injunction." and the publishers had in fact included on the back cover of the book a short piece saying that this was the almost complete story of Robert Maxwell, and he argued that this meant that what had been left out of the book would be the complete story, and therefore we were saying that what had been cut out was in fact true, which he said was a breach of the legal agreement.
So the book was withdrawn yet again, and it didn't reappear until after Maxwell's death. This was partly because the publishers weren't prepared to finance an extended appeal, but Maxwell also piled on the pressure by extending his threats to booksellers.
Bang, bang.
What Maxwell did in relation to the Bauer book was amazing. He tried to stop all booksellers from distributing the book.
He scattered threats of legal action around like confetti. All the major bookshops, all the wholesalers were warned that if they handled Maxwell, The Portrait of Power, they would be sued for libel.
Some booksellers complied and refused to sell the offending biographies. Others were more robust.
We kept the book on sale, and I think by the end we were pretty well the only bookseller in Britain to do so. I think we were the only bookseller in Britain to do so, and we refused to give in. We wanted to take legal advice of our own. We wanted to take a more measured view about whether this book was libelous or not. And we held out for as long as we could, which was actually some weeks. But at the end, we got absolutely buried in threats, and it came to a point where we felt we couldn't risk the sort of sums of money which were being threatened. It was a most unpleasant chapter, I must say.
It wasn't only biographies that got driven off the shelves. Even the Chronicle of the 20th Century found itself being pursued by libel lawyers for an honest mistake.
Well, there were rather fewer references to Robert Maxwell than one used to find in the Daily Mirror when he owned it. Most of them are about, indeed, the publisher and proprietor of the Daily Mirror. Referenced here going back to 1968 when he and Rupert Murdoch, the young Rupert Murdoch, locked in battle for ownership of the News of the World. And they're mostly about Robert Maxwell's career, the Robert Maxwell we know and love. But there is one other reference to another Robert Maxwell. 29th of April 1987, Tripoli. Alleged British spy Robert Maxwell is freed on Colonel Gaddafi's orders. That's all it said. But come to the index, and this is where we made a mistake, and the indexer did not distinguish between the two Robert Maxwells. So we've now got both Robert Maxwells put together. They're the one entry for the alleged British spy and the other references to the proprietor, all merged as one. Our counsel's advice was that we might well win. He thought we had a sporting chance of winning, but he couldn't guarantee it, of course. He said that if we lost, the damages against us would not be particularly high. They might even be derisory. But even if they were derisory, we might still have to pay Mr. Maxwell's legal costs as well as the derisory damages. So you put in those together with our own costs, you're looking at, I mean, he said not less than £150,000.
Fresh from persecuting the Chronicle of the 20th Century, Maxwell turned his attention to the Mail on Sunday, which he was convinced was running a vendetta against him. As usual, a libel writ was soon on the way. But then the tables were turned. When the Mail on Sunday ran a story about Maxwell's antics in the football arena, he denounced the article as a fabrication. And so, Maxwell himself was sued for libel.
Frankly, it's the sort of thing which I would, under any other circumstances, have ignored, because I think that if you're a newspaper man and you're attacked, you must sort of expect that. And not complain too much. Newspaper men do tend to complain too much. But Robert Maxwell is a different category. To be the biter, or to see the biter bit, was very pleasant. And one of the happier days of my life was to hear in court the following. Mr. Maxwell has apologized to the plaintiff, namely myself, and is here today to acknowledge his error and to apologize in open court. He's also agreed to pay substantial damages. Now that was these were very pleasant words to hear.
Robert Maxwell was more at home in his traditional role of plaintiff.
I'm delighted that a jury of 12 men and women of this country upheld the fact that Private Eye is a lying organ, a disgrace to journalism, and a foul imposition on the country.
The allegation was that Maxwell had been giving money to the Labour Party and financing sort of foreign trips by Neil Kinnock, and that there was some suggestion that he was hoping to get a peerage out of it. It seemed to me at the time, and now actually, to be a fairly trivial story. He sued, and I think, looking back on it, we were very ill-advised to go to court, to take him to court. It would prove to be a very expensive and very disastrous case from the Eye's point of view.
But a lucrative one from Maxwell's point of view. The jury gave him £50,000 in punitive damages because the Eye couldn't produce its witness. Several people who were sued by Maxwell, who thought they had very strong cases, later found, as the court hearing approached, that their witnesses tended to disappear on them. Did you have that sort of experience?
Yes, this was the most terrifying aspect of dealing with Robert Maxwell, the sudden realization that he did not play the game like everybody else. He was, in a very real sense, not, when it came to the law, an English gentleman. What would happen is that one would have witnesses, people who telephoned one in the first place, to ask one to try to correct one of the wrongs which Robert Maxwell had done to them. One would run the story, he would sue, one would be back to one source and say, now the man sued, I assume we can have your cooperation when it comes to a court case. And they would not be there. The phone would go dead.
I remember when we were dealing with Maxwell, one particular man, who was a notary public, told one of our reporters that Maxwell had signed 2 affidavits on the same day, one of which said that a particular company had no assets, and one of which said it had a great many assets. Obviously, he had different reasons for making these 2 statements. So we said, fine, that's a very, very good illustration of the sort of attitude he has to the truth. When we went back to this chap on our lawyer's advice and said, okay, we actually need not just the affidavits themselves, but we need the notary public to give evidence that he actually had the affidavit sworn in his presence. At that point, the chap said, well, very unfortunate, I've gone to work for one of Mr. Maxwell's solicitors at this point.
More recently, Maxwell's reaction to my piece about him on The Late Show was slightly more restrained, but only in the sense that he didn't actually sue.
This was a travesty of the truth of what they did, and I could have collected from the BBC at least £1 million in damages. I decided not to do it simply because I don't need the £1 million, and I'm certainly not going to pick the pockets of the licence payers.
This heroic reluctance to sue the BBC didn't last long. When Panorama investigated him last year, he retaliated furiously, through his lawyers and in his newspapers.
Panorama has examined the accounts of several private Maxwell companies. By the middle of last year, many of them also had big borrowings. At the end of June 1990, these companies had borrowed more than £650 million, and some of them were using shares in Maxwell Communication as security for their borrowings.
After a couple of months, it was evident that he wasn't going to help at all. And in fact, he'd put out an edict to everyone in the Mirror that they'd be sacked simply for talking to us. So then it went quiet for a few months until the last 2-3 weeks before transmission, when obviously, because the programme was ready to go, it was only fair that we put to him the main charges in the programme. So we opened up communication again, and I wrote him this rather coded but extremely elaborate letter laying out the main areas in the programme and asking him for an interview. His response was to say, get lost.
He decided to take more direct steps, and he phoned me up. And because one of the things he supplied me with in those letters was a series of transcripts of conversations secretly recorded by him between my researchers and various senior Mirror Group and Maxwell Communication Corporation executives. And it was clear that he was doing secret recordings. We decided that just in case it ever came to the crunch, we'd better record the conversations as well.
This is a program about me and my life and contribution to this country for 40 years. And if you tell me that you're going to stick with the program, all I can tell you is that you will have a writ on your table tomorrow morning. And there's no consideration possible for me to be involved, because you cannot say that you will be fair in this program and then tell me that you can libel me by the mere title of the program.
The last thing he said to me on the telephone was, I give good value. And I think in some ways, my regret, I wish we could have persuaded him to take part in our programme, because I think in one level, not in the strictly financial perhaps, but in other ways, I think he did give good value. And to the extent to which he provided the rest of us with this astonishing figure, I think he made a contribution. But as far as litigation and journalistic standards, I think he was really a disaster.
If you want me to participate, make sure that I accept that it is fair, and I give good value for money.
And as a litigant, he kept giving it right up to the end. Only a month before his death, Private Eye printed an article claiming that he was tampering with the Mirror Group pension fund. Inevitably, he sued. It was probably the last writ he ever issued.
Francis Wheen reporting.